The first sign something was wrong wasn't the empty hotel suite or the missing luggage. It was the smirk on the concierge's face when Elena Roswell asked about her husband's whereabouts. A barely concealed amusement that suggested he knew exactly what had happened to the rest of her travel party. Standing in the marble lobby of the George V Hotel in her wrinkled traveling clothes, jet-lagged and confused, Elena felt the familiar weight of isolation that had been growing in her marriage for months. The difference was that this time, she was 3,000 miles from home, with nothing but her passport, a purse, and the growing certainty that she'd been deliberately abandoned in one of the world's most expensive cities. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other luxury vacation. Elena had awakened in her first-class seat as the plane descended into Charles de Gaulle Airport, expecting to find her husband David and his 3 business partners chatting excitedly about their week-long corporate retreat in Paris. Instead, she'd discovered their seats empty, their carry-on bags gone, and a flight attendant who claimed they'd disembarked during an unscheduled stop in London that Elena had somehow slept through. The confusion had deepened at baggage claim. Her suitcase was nowhere to be found, but a uniformed airline representative handed her a prepaid phone with a single message from David. Change of plans. Handle the Paris reservation. See you back home. The casual dismissal in those few words had hit her like a physical blow. After 15 years of marriage, after all the sacrifices she'd made for his career, this was how little her presence mattered to him? Elena had built her life around supporting David's ambitions. She'd given up her own promising career in art authentication to manage their social calendar, host elaborate dinners for his clients, and maintain the perfect image of a successful executive's wife. She'd become an expert at reading the room, understanding the subtle dynamics between David and his partners at Meridian Capital Management, and ensuring that their home served as the ideal backdrop for the high-stakes financial deals that funded their luxurious lifestyle. The taxi ride from the airport to the hotel had been a blur of Parisian streets and mounting anxiety. Elena's mind raced through possible explanations for the group's disappearance. Emergency business meeting, family crisis, some kind of misunderstanding with their travel arrangements. She'd clung to these rational possibilities, even as a darker suspicion grew in the back of her mind. The George V Hotel stood on Avenue George V like a monument to French elegance, its flag snapping in the autumn breeze. Elena had stayed here twice before with David, always marveling at the opulent interiors and impeccable service. Now, approaching the reception desk alone, she felt like an imposter wearing clothes that suddenly seemed inadequate for such surroundings. Madame Roswell, the desk clerk, had greeted her with professional warmth before his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid there's been a change to your reservation." Elena's stomach had dropped. "What kind of change?" "The suite has been canceled. Your companions checked out early this morning and settled the account." The clerk's English was perfect, but his manner suggested he was delivering rehearsed information. However, they did leave instructions for alternative accommodations. Alternative accommodations? Elena had repeated, struggling to process what she was hearing. The clerk had handed her a key card in a sealed envelope. "A standard room has been reserved for one night only, with checkout tomorrow at noon. The envelope contains additional information from your party." Elena's hands had trembled as she opened the envelope in the elevator. Inside was a brief note in David's handwriting and a train ticket. "Elena, the business opportunity in London requires immediate attention. Take the train tomorrow evening. Everything will be explained when you get home. Use the credit card for necessary expenses. David." The clinical tone of the note, the complete absence of affection or concern, had crystallized something that Elena had been refusing to acknowledge for months. This wasn't just about a changed travel itinerary. This was about power, control, and the systematic erosion of her place in David's life. The standard room turned out to be a converted storage space on the hotel's top floor, barely large enough for a single bed and a minuscule bathroom. Through the tiny window, Elena could see the Eiffel Tower gleaming in the distance, a mockery of the romantic getaway she'd imagined when David first mentioned the Paris trip. She'd sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still wearing her travel clothes, and tried to call David's cell phone. The number had been disconnected. That first night, Elena had barely slept. She'd replayed every interaction from the weeks leading up to the trip, searching for clues she might have missed. There had been whispered phone conversations that stopped whenever she entered the room. Unexpected visitors to their home office, who David claimed were potential clients, but who never seemed to conduct any actual business. A growing sense that she was being deliberately excluded from conversations and decisions that affected their shared life. By morning, Elena had made a decision. She wasn't going to meekly board a train and return home to whatever explanation David decided to provide. She was going to find out exactly what kind of business had been so urgent that it required abandoning her in a foreign country without warning or adequate resources. Her first stop was the Hotel Business Center, where she used her remaining credit on David's emergency card to print out their flight confirmations and review their original itinerary. The documents revealed several discrepancies that she'd missed in her jet-lagged state the previous day. The original reservation had shown 5 passengers: Elena, David, and his 3 business partners, Marcus Webb, Jonathan Pierce, and Andrew Chen. But the actual flight manifest that she managed to access through the airline's website showed only 4 passengers who had completed the journey to London. Elena's exclusion from the London portion of the trip had been planned from the beginning. She spent the next several hours in the hotel lobby, nursing expensive coffee and using the complimentary Wi-Fi to investigate Meridian Capital Management's recent activities. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The company was in severe financial trouble, facing multiple investigations from securities regulators and owing substantial sums to overseas investors. Several major clients had withdrawn their funds in recent months, and there were rumors of improper handling of client assets. More disturbing was a series of news articles about wealthy Americans who had mysteriously disappeared while traveling abroad, only to resurface weeks later claiming memory loss or temporary amnesia. In each case, substantial insurance claims had been filed by surviving family members or business partners. The pattern was subtle, but unmistakable to someone with Elena's eye for detail and authentication experience. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown international number. "Stop digging. Take the train home. Forget what you think you know." Elena stared at the message, her heart racing. Someone was watching her internet activity, monitoring her movements. The business retreat story was a cover for something much more sinister, and her presence in Paris was threatening whatever plan David and his partners had set in motion. Instead of feeling intimidated, Elena felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. She'd spent 15 years being the perfect, compliant wife, asking no questions and making no demands that might interfere with David's ambitions. That version of herself had been abandoned at Charles de Gaulle Airport along with her luggage. Elena checked out of the George V Hotel but didn't head to the train station. Instead, she used the last of her available credit to rent a modest apartment in the Marais district, far from the touristy areas where she might be easily spotted. The apartment belonged to an elderly French woman named Madame Dubois, who asked no questions about Elena's circumstances and accepted payment in cash that Elena had managed to exchange at a currency booth. From her new base of operations, Elena began a more systematic investigation into Meridian Capital's overseas activities. She discovered that the company had been using international travel as a cover for moving assets offshore, often involving elaborate scenarios designed to obscure the actual ownership and location of client funds. David and his partners weren't just embezzling money, they were running a sophisticated financial shell game that stretched across multiple countries and currencies. The deeper Elena dug, the more she realized that her abandonment in Paris wasn't just cruel indifference, it was part of a specific strategy. David needed her to be geographically isolated and financially dependent, while he and his partners executed whatever phase of their plan required her absence. The question was why her presence back home would interfere with their activities.
The answer came when Elena managed to access their joint banking accounts through online portals that still recognized her login credentials. David had been systematically transferring assets into her name without her knowledge, making her the legal owner of properties and investments that she'd never seen or authorized. On paper, Elena Roswell appeared to be the primary beneficiary of Meridian Capital's various offshore holdings. She was being set up as the fall guy for her husband's crimes. The realization hit her like a physical blow. David hadn't just abandoned her in Paris. He'd been positioning her to take the blame for years of financial fraud, while he and his partners disappeared with the actual proceeds. Her signature had been forged on documents creating shell companies in her name. Her social security number had been used to establish accounts in tax haven countries. Her identity had been stolen by the person she trusted most. Elena sat in the tiny Parisian apartment, surrounded by printed documents and laptop screens showing the evidence of her husband's betrayal, and felt something shift fundamentally inside her. The hurt and confusion were being replaced by a cold, calculating fury. David and his partners had made a critical mistake in underestimating her. They saw her as a decorative accessory to their lifestyle, someone too naive and dependent to pose any real threat to their plans. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Elena's first call was to her former colleague at Sotheby's auction house, Catherine Morrison, who had maintained her connections in the art authentication world even after Elena had left to focus on her marriage. Catherine was surprised to hear from Elena, but quickly became serious when Elena explained that she needed help investigating financial documents that might involve art fraud or money laundering through collectibles. "Elena, are you in some kind of trouble?" Catherine asked, her voice filled with concern. "Not the kind you think," Elena replied carefully, "but I need to understand some transactions that involve art purchases and international transfers. Can you recommend someone in Paris who might be able to help?" Catherine was quiet for a moment before responding. "There's a man named Philippe Moreau who works with the Financial Crimes Unit at the French Treasury. He specializes in art-related money laundering. But Elena, if you're dealing with something serious, you need to be very careful about who you trust." "I'm learning that lesson the hard way," Elena said. Philippe Moreau agreed to meet Elena at a quiet cafe in the Saint-Germain district the following afternoon. He was a slight man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and the careful demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with complex financial crimes. When Elena explained her situation in broad terms, he listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. "Madame Roswell," he said when she finished, "what you describe sounds like a classic pattern of financial fraud using international travel and identity manipulation. These schemes often involve creating false documentation to make innocent parties appear complicit, while the actual perpetrators establish untraceable offshore accounts." "Is there a way to prove what they've done?" Elena asked. "Possibly," Philippe replied, "but it would require access to the actual financial records, documentation of the forged signatures, and evidence of the planned abandonment strategy. Do you have any of these things?" Elena pulled out a folder containing printouts of the banking documents she'd accessed. Philippe examined them carefully, his expression growing more serious as he reviewed each page. "This is quite sophisticated," he admitted. "The shell companies are registered in multiple jurisdictions, which makes tracking the actual money flows very difficult. However, there are some patterns here that suggest the perpetrators made certain assumptions about timeline and detection." "What kind of assumptions?" "They appear to have planned for a specific window of time when you would be unable to access these accounts or discover the unauthorized activity. Your isolation in Paris suggests they needed several days or perhaps weeks to complete whatever financial transfers they had planned." Elena felt a chill of understanding. "So by staying in Paris instead of going home, I'm interfering with their timeline?" "Exactly, and that gives us leverage." Philippe explained that financial crimes involving international jurisdictions often relied on precise timing to avoid detection. If Elena's discovery of the scheme was premature, it might be possible to trace the money transfers before they were completed and identify the actual recipients of the stolen funds. However, he warned, you need to understand that these people have already demonstrated they're willing to commit serious crimes. If they realize you're actively investigating rather than simply missing, they may take more direct action to protect their interests. Elena thought about the threatening text message she'd received at the hotel. "I think they already know I'm not following their script." "Then you need to move quickly and carefully.
I can arrange for you to speak with investigators who specialize in international financial crimes, but you'll need to provide them with concrete evidence of the fraudulent activity. That evening, Elena returned to her apartment with a clear mission. She needed to gather proof that David and his partners were using her identity fraudulently while simultaneously documenting their own criminal activities. It was dangerous work, but Elena found herself energized by the intellectual challenge and the prospect of turning the tables on the men who had betrayed her. She started by creating detailed timelines of all the suspicious financial activities she'd discovered, cross-referencing them with David's travel schedule and business meetings. A pattern emerged that showed systematic asset transfers occurring whenever David traveled internationally, with Elena's forged authorization appearing on documents she'd never seen. More importantly, Elena discovered that Meridian Capital's overseas activities weren't limited to embezzlement. The company appeared to be facilitating money laundering for external clients, using the same identity manipulation and travel-based schemes to obscure the sources of suspicious funds. David and his partners weren't just thieves, they were operating a criminal enterprise that provided financial services to other lawbreakers. Elena's investigation was interrupted by a knock at her apartment door. Through the peephole, she saw a well-dressed man she didn't recognize holding what appeared to be official credentials. Her heart racing, she quietly gathered her most important documents and laptop, stuffing them into a bag she kept ready for exactly this situation. "Madame Roswell," the man called through the door, "I'm Inspector Laurent with the Paris police. We need to speak with you about some irregularities with your visa status." Elena knew immediately that this was no police officer. Philippe had warned her that sophisticated financial criminals often had connections in law enforcement or access to official-looking credentials. The timing of this visit, just hours after her meeting with Philippe, suggested that someone was monitoring her activities more closely than she'd realized. She slipped out the apartment's back window onto a fire escape, grateful for the building's old architecture that provided multiple escape routes. From the adjacent rooftop, she could see the supposed inspector trying to jimmy the lock on her apartment door while speaking quietly into a radio device. Elena made her way across the rooftops until she reached a building several blocks away, then descended to street level and melted into the evening crowd of pedestrians. Her phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "Stop now or face consequences. This is your final warning." Instead of fear, Elena felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The fact that they were threatening her meant she was close to something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. Her investigation was working, and they were running scared. She called Philippe from a payphone, speaking in code they'd agreed upon. Within an hour, she was sitting in the back room of a small restaurant in Belleville, explaining the evening's events to Philippe and two colleagues from the French Financial Crimes Unit. "They're escalating quickly," observed Inspector Marie Duval, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in international fraud cases. "This suggests they're operating on a compressed timeline, possibly because of external pressure from their clients or regulatory investigations." "What kind of external pressure?" Elena asked. "Money laundering operations often serve clients who don't tolerate delays or exposure," Philippe explained. "If your husband's company has committed to facilitating specific transfers by certain dates, failure to deliver could result in serious consequences for them." Inspector Duval pulled out a tablet and showed Elena a series of surveillance photos. "We've been watching Meridian Capital's European activities for several months as part of a larger investigation into financial crimes targeting American expatriates. Your husband and his partners have been meeting with individuals connected to organized crime syndicates that use legitimate businesses to clean illegal proceeds." Elena stared at the photos, showing David shaking hands with men she didn't recognize in expensive suits, all smiles and apparent camaraderie. The David she'd married would never have associated with criminals, but that David had apparently been replaced long ago by someone she didn't know at all. "The question now," Inspector Duval continued, "is whether you're willing to help us gather the evidence needed to shut down their operation and recover the stolen funds." Elena didn't hesitate. "What do you need me to do?" The plan they developed was both simple and dangerous. Elena would return to her apartment, knowing it was being watched, and appear to resume her normal activities while actually documenting everything she could about Meridian Capital's criminal network. The French authorities would provide backup surveillance and communication equipment, but Elena would be largely on her own until they had enough evidence to make arrests.
The risk, Philippe warned, is that they may decide you know too much and take direct action to silence you. They already made that decision when they framed me for their crimes, Elena replied. Now it's my turn to make some decisions about their future. The next morning, Elena returned to her apartment building openly, carrying shopping bags and acting like a tourist who had spent the night elsewhere. The supposed inspector from the previous evening was gone, but she noticed a man reading a newspaper in a cafe across the street who seemed to be paying unusual attention to her building's entrance. Inside the apartment, Elena discovered that her belongings had been thoroughly searched. Her computer was missing, along with most of the printed documents she'd left behind. However, the searchers had missed a hidden folder of photocopies she'd concealed inside a hollowed-out guidebook, and her most sensitive materials were safely stored in an encrypted cloud account they couldn't access. Elena spent the day rebuilding her case file while maintaining the appearance of a frustrated wife trying to contact her husband. She made several loud phone calls to David's disconnected number, complaining about being stranded and demanding explanations. To anyone listening, she sounded angry but clueless about the broader implications of her situation. Meanwhile, she was using secure communication channels provided by Philippe to transmit copies of financial documents, evidence of forged signatures to the French investigators. Each piece of evidence strengthened the case against Meridian Capital and revealed new aspects of their criminal operations. The breakthrough came when Elena managed to access David's personal email account using a password she remembered from their early marriage. David had never been good with computer security, and he'd apparently continued using variations of the same password for years. His email contained months of correspondence with clients who were clearly seeking money laundering services, detailed instructions for creating false documentation, and schedules for international transfers that involved millions of dollars. More importantly, Elena found emails discussing her specifically. David and his partners had planned her abandonment in Paris as part of a larger scheme to fake David's death during a climbing accident in the Swiss Alps.
With Elena stranded abroad and unable to access legal counsel, they would have time to complete massive asset transfers before she could interfere with their plans. The insurance payout from David's supposed death would provide additional funds while leaving Elena to face the legal consequences of the money laundering operation. Elena stared at the emails detailing her husband's plan to fake his own death and frame her for his crimes, feeling a cold rage settle over her. David hadn't just betrayed their marriage, he'd been planning to destroy her life completely while he started fresh with a new identity and stolen millions. She forwarded the most damaging emails to Philippe, then continued searching through David's digital files. What she found exceeded even her worst expectations. Meridian Capital wasn't just facilitating money laundering, they were operating a complex network that included human trafficking, arms dealing, and drug distribution. Elena's husband had become a central figure in an international criminal organization that used legitimate financial services as cover for multiple illegal enterprises. The scope of the operation explained why they'd been so determined to control Elena's movements and legal status. She wasn't just a convenient scapegoat, she was a potential witness to crimes that could result in life sentences for everyone involved. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Philippe. Package delivered, preparing for pickup, stay safe. The French authorities now had enough evidence to begin coordinating with American law enforcement agencies to shut down Meridian Capital's operations on both sides of the Atlantic. Elena's role was nearly complete, but the most dangerous phase was just beginning. That evening, Elena noticed increased surveillance around her building. The man with the newspaper had been joined by others, and she spotted what appeared to be professional surveillance equipment being positioned in nearby windows. David and his partners had apparently decided that Elena posed too great a threat to be allowed to continue her investigation. Elena prepared for what she suspected would be her final night in the Parisian apartment. She'd accomplished her primary objective of gathering evidence against the criminals who had betrayed her, but she knew they wouldn't simply allow her to return home with that knowledge. The next 24 hours would determine whether she emerged from this situation as a victim or as the architect of her husband's downfall. As she settled in to wait for whatever confrontation was coming, Elena reflected on how completely her life had changed since that first morning in the Georges V Hotel. The abandoned wife who had meekly accepted her husband's dismissive note no longer existed.
In her place was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to those who had underestimated her. David and his partners had thought it would be hilarious to ditch her in Paris, leaving her stranded and helpless while they executed their criminal plans. They were about to discover that their expensive mistake had created their most formidable enemy. The game was just beginning, and Elena intended to win. Elena woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of careful footsteps on the fire escape outside her window. The surveillance team had grown tired of waiting for her to make a mistake, and they were moving to a more direct approach. She slipped from her bed fully clothed, having learned to sleep in her street clothes with her emergency bag within arm's reach, and positioned herself behind the heavy wooden armoire that offered the best cover in the small room. The window lock was being manipulated with professional tools, the metal giving way with barely a whisper of sound. Elena counted 3 distinct sets of footsteps as the intruders entered her apartment, their movements coordinated and efficient. These weren't the bumbling corporate executives she'd married into. These were professionals who understood how to eliminate problems quietly and permanently. Her phone vibrated silently with a prearranged signal from Philippe. The French authorities were in position outside the building, but they needed Elena to stay alive long enough for the intruders to incriminate themselves with actionable threats or violence. The recording devices Philippe had provided were capturing everything, but French law required clear evidence of criminal intent before they could intervene. "She's not in the bed," whispered a voice with an American accent that Elena didn't recognize. "Check the bathroom and the closet." "Windows are locked from inside," replied another voice, this one carrying a slight Eastern European accent. "She's here somewhere." Elena pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind the armoire, controlling her breathing and trying to identify how many people had entered her apartment. The floorboards creaked under multiple sets of feet as they conducted a systematic search, checking every possible hiding place with methodical precision. "Found her laptop and more printed documents. She's been busy." "Doesn't matter now," said a third voice, one that made Elena's blood freeze. It was Marcus Webb, David's business partner, speaking with the casual tone of someone discussing dinner plans rather than breaking into an occupied apartment. After tonight, she won't be sharing any more information with anyone. Elena's hand tightened on the small recording device Philippe had given her. Marcus's presence confirmed that Meridian Capital's senior partners were directly involved in whatever was about to happen, eliminating any possibility that this was just overzealous security contractors acting independently. "The French cops are sniffing around," Marcus continued. "David's getting nervous about the timeline. We need to wrap this up and move to phase 2 before she causes any more problems." "What about the Swiss setup?" asked the American voice. "Everything still on schedule for tomorrow?" "David's already at the base camp," Marcus replied. "Climbing accident happens at dawn, body never recovered, insurance pays out within the week. By the time anyone realizes Elena's missing, we'll have completed the final transfers and disappeared." Elena felt a surge of cold satisfaction. They were confessing to multiple felonies while French law enforcement recording every word. David's plan to fake his death in the Alps was being documented in real time, along with their intention to murder her to prevent interference with their criminal enterprise. The search was moving closer to her hiding place. Elena could hear them checking behind furniture and inside cabinets, their movements becoming more urgent as they realized she wasn't simply sleeping somewhere unexpectedly. Soon they would reach the armoire, and her only advantages would be surprise and the knowledge that help is minutes away. "Check behind that big cabinet," ordered the Eastern European voice. "And remember, it needs to look like an accident. Despondent wife, abandoned by husband, tragic suicide in romantic Paris." Elena heard footsteps approaching her position and made her decision. As the first intruder rounded the corner of the armoire, she struck him in the throat with a ceramic vase from Madame Dubois' collection, dropping him gasping to the floor.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The crash of breaking pottery alerted the other two, but Elena was already moving, using the fallen man's body as a stepping stone to reach the window. "She's running!" Marcus shouted, lunging toward her as she wrestled with the window latch. Elena's months of yoga classes and weekend hiking with David had kept her in better shape than any of them expected. She got the window open and rolled onto the fire escape just as Marcus's hand grabbed at her ankle. His grip slipped on the smooth metal of the escape platform,
and Elena scrambled upward toward the roof while shouts erupted behind her. The building's rooftop offered multiple escape routes across the interconnected structures of the Marais district, but Elena could hear her pursuers following close behind. More concerning were the voices calling up from the street level, suggesting that the operation involved more than just the 3 men who had entered her apartment. Elena's phone buzzed with another message from Philippe. Moving in 30 seconds. Stay visible. She understood the instruction. The French authorities needed clear sightlines to confirm her identity and safety before they could act. But remaining visible also meant exposing herself to whatever weapons the intruders might be carrying. Elena positioned herself near the building's edge, where police spotters could see her clearly, while keeping the roof's ventilation equipment between herself and the access door. Marcus emerged onto the roof first, breathing heavily and clearly frustrated by the chase. In the ambient light from the street below, Elena could see that he was carrying what appeared to be a syringe rather than a conventional weapon. They really had planned to make her death look like suicide, probably using some combination of drugs that would suggest a mental breakdown rather than murder. "Elena, stop running," Marcus called out, trying to project calm authority despite his obvious agitation. "We just want to talk. David sent us to bring you home safely." "Like you brought me to Paris safely?" Elena replied, staying behind the ventilation unit but keeping her voice loud enough for any listening devices to pick up clearly. "Was abandoning me at the hotel part of David's concern for my safety too?" "That was a misunderstanding," Marcus said, moving slowly closer while the other 2 men spread out to flank her position. "Business emergency required immediate attention. You know how these things work." Elena almost laughed at the absurdity of the lie. Business emergency that required faking David's death and framing me for money laundering? That kind of emergency? Marcus stopped moving, realizing that Elena knew far more about their plans than they'd anticipated. "You've been talking to the wrong people, Elena, making accusations you can't prove." "Actually, I can prove everything," Elena replied, holding up the recording device Philippe had given her, "including your confession about David's climbing accident and your plans to make my death look like suicide. The French authorities have been listening to every word you've said since you broke into my apartment." The effect was immediate. Marcus spun around looking for signs of police presence, while the other 2 men began moving more urgently toward Elena's position. The careful facade of concerned business associates had dissolved, replaced by the desperate aggression of cornered criminals. "Take her down now," Marcus hissed to his companions. "Forget about making it look accidental." Elena heard the distinctive sound of sirens approaching from multiple directions as French police units converged on the building. Philippe's team had been waiting for exactly this moment when the intruders abandoned any pretense of legitimate business and revealed their willingness to commit violence. The man with the Eastern European accent produced a pistol and aimed it toward Elena's position, but hesitated when spotlights suddenly blazed from surrounding rooftops. French tactical officers had been positioned to provide coverage for exactly this situation, and the gunman found himself illuminated and targeted by multiple red laser dots. "Drop your weapons and place your hands on your heads," commanded a voice speaking French-accented English through a bullhorn. "You are surrounded by armed police officers." What followed was a carefully orchestrated arrest that Philippe's team had clearly rehearsed for similar situations. The 3 intruders were separated, disarmed, and secured with minimal resistance once they realized the futility of their position. Elena was escorted to safety by Inspector Duval, who had been monitoring the situation from a command post in the adjacent building. "Excellent work," Inspector Duval told Elena as they descended the building's main staircase. "The recordings we obtained tonight will provide crucial evidence, not just against these individuals, but against the entire Meridian Capital network." Elena felt a mixture of relief and anticipation as they reached street level where multiple police vehicles were processing the arrested intruders. What happens now? "Now, we coordinate with American law enforcement to arrest David and his remaining partners before they can complete their planned asset transfers," Inspector Duval explained. "And we use the evidence you've gathered to dismantle the entire money laundering operation." Elena's phone rang with a call from an international number she didn't recognize. Inspector Duval nodded for her to answer while she activated recording equipment to capture the conversation. "Elena?" The voice was David's, calling from what sounded like a satellite phone with poor connection quality. "Thank God you're safe. I just heard about some kind of police incident at your apartment." Inspector Duvall met Inspector Duvall's eyes and received an encouraging nod. "I'm fine, David, though I have to say, your friends Marcus, Jonathan, and Andrew showed remarkable concern for my welfare. They were so worried about my safety that they broke into my apartment at 3 in the morning." The silence on David's end stretched for several seconds before he responded with forced casualness. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Marcus mentioned he was going to check on you, but I certainly didn't authorize any kind of intrusion." "What about authorizing the use of my identity to create shell companies for money laundering?" Elena asked, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "Or forging my signature on documents transferring millions of dollars to offshore accounts?"
Were those misunderstandings too? Another pause, longer this time. When David spoke again, his voice had changed completely, dropping the pretense of concerned husband. "Elena, you need to understand that you're in over your head here. There are people involved in this situation who don't tolerate interference. For your own safety, you should take the next flight home and forget whatever you think you've discovered." "Like the climbing accident you have planned for tomorrow morning?" Elena replied. "The one where your body will never be recovered but the insurance company will pay out millions to your grieving widow?" The sharp intake of breath on David's end confirmed that Elena had accurate information about his plans. Inspector Duvall was making rapid notes while coordinating with other team members who were clearly preparing to act on the intelligence Elena was extracting from the conversation. "How could you possibly know about that?" David asked, abandoning any remaining pretense. "The same way I know about the arms dealing, the human trafficking, and the drug distribution network that Meridian Capital has been facilitating," Elena replied. "You've been very thorough in documenting your crimes, David, almost like you wanted someone to find the evidence eventually." "That evidence will never hold up in court," David said, but Elena could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "And even if it did, you're implicated in every transaction. Your signatures, your accounts, your legal responsibility for everything we've done." Elena smiled, knowing that David couldn't see her expression, but hoping he could hear the confidence in her voice. "Forged signatures, actually, and I have documentation proving that my identity was stolen systematically over several years. The French authorities have been very helpful in establishing that I was in the United States with verified alibis for most of the international transactions you've been conducting in my name." Inspector Duvall handed Elena a note indicating that American law enforcement had been contacted and were moving to intercept David at his location in Switzerland. The coordinated response was happening in real time, with Elena's phone call serving as the trigger for simultaneous arrests across multiple countries. "David," Elena continued, "you should know that Marcus and your other partners are currently in French police custody. They were very talkative about your plans and the broader criminal network you've been operating. I'm sure they'll have interesting things to say about your leadership role in the organization." The line went dead as David realized the implications of what Elena had just told him. Inspector Duvall immediately contacted her Swiss counterparts to confirm that David's location had been traced and that arrest teams were moving to intercept him before he could reach the climbing area where his faked death was supposed to occur. Elena found herself sitting in the back of a police vehicle as dawn broke over Paris, watching the building where she'd spent the most terrifying and empowering night of her life. The abandoned wife who had arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport less than a week ago no longer existed. In her place was someone who had systematically dismantled a criminal enterprise and orchestrated the downfall of the husband who had betrayed her. Philippe joined her in the vehicle, carrying a tablet displaying real-time updates from law enforcement agencies across 3 countries. "The Swiss authorities arrested David at the foot camp 2 hours ago," he reported. "He was carrying climbing equipment, forged identification documents, and a detailed plan for staging his own death that matches exactly what you recorded him discussing." "What about the other Meridian Capital partners?" Elena asked. "Jonathan Pierce was arrested at his home in Connecticut, and Andrew Chen was taken into custody at JFK Airport as he attempted to board a flight to the Cayman Islands," Philippe replied. "The coordinated arrests have been remarkably successful,
thanks largely to the evidence you gathered and the confessions we recorded last night." Elena leaned back in the seat, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. How long will they be imprisoned? Given the scope of the charges and the international nature of the crimes, we're looking at decades rather than years, Philippe explained. Money laundering, fraud, identity theft, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and facilitating organized crime activities. Your husband and his partners will be fortunate if they see freedom again before they're elderly men. Inspector Duval approached the vehicle with additional documentation. Elena, there's one more aspect of this situation that you need to understand. The money that was stolen and laundered through your identity has been frozen and will be subject to asset forfeiture proceedings. However, as the victim of identity theft, you may be entitled to substantial compensation for the damages you've suffered. Elena looked up sharply. What kind of compensation? The preliminary accounting suggests that Meridian Capital processed over $40 million through accounts established in your name without your knowledge or consent, Inspector Duval explained. Under both French and American law, you may be entitled to damages that could amount to several $1,000,000, in addition to the recovery of your legitimate assets that were stolen. The irony was almost overwhelming. David and his partners had thought they were setting Elena up to take the blame for their crimes while they disappeared with the profits. Instead, their systematic theft of her identity had made her the legal victim entitled to compensation that dwarfed anything she'd lost in their original betrayal. Philippe smiled at Elena's expression of stunned realization. There's more. The criminal enterprise that Meridian Capital was facilitating included several wealthy clients who used their services to hide assets from legitimate authorities. Those assets are also subject to forfeiture, and victims of the underlying crimes may be entitled to restitution from those funds. Elena shook her head in amazement. So their plan to frame me for their crimes actually gives me legal standing to claim the proceeds from the entire criminal network? Essentially, yes, Inspector Duval confirmed. The forged documents that were supposed to implicate you in their money laundering activities actually document your status as the primary victim of a systematic identity theft operation. The courts will likely award you substantial damages from the criminal proceeds that are recovered. As the police vehicles departed from the Marais district, Elena found herself contemplating a future she never could have imagined when she'd arrived in Paris as an abandoned wife. David's cruel joke of ditching her in one of the world's most expensive cities was about to become the foundation for her financial independence and the complete destruction of everything he'd worked to build. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from her former colleague, Catherine, at Sotheby's. "Heard through the grapevine that you've been having adventures in Paris. When you're ready to return to work, we have a position open in our financial crimes investigation unit. Your recent experience might be exactly what we need."
Elena smiled as she typed her response. "I'll definitely be interested in discussing opportunities when I return to New York. I seem to have developed some new skills in financial investigation that might be useful." The message felt symbolic of the broader transformation that had occurred over the past week. Elena was returning to the art authentication world that she'd abandoned for David's sake, but now with experience and expertise that made her far more valuable than when she'd left. She was no longer the supportive wife whose career took second place to her husband's ambitions. She was an independent professional with demonstrated abilities in complex financial investigation. Philippe's phone rang with updates from the ongoing investigation. After a brief conversation, he turned to Elena with news that would reshape her understanding of the criminal network she'd helped expose. "The financial records from Meridian Capital's servers have revealed something extraordinary," Philippe explained. "The company wasn't just facilitating money laundering for external clients, they were operating as the financial hub for a network of criminal enterprises that spans multiple continents and involves billions of dollars in illegal transactions." Elena felt a chill of understanding, meaning that the compensation I might receive could be substantially larger than we initially calculated. Potentially, yes, but it also means that the people whose criminal operations have been exposed may view you as responsible for their losses, Philippe learned. The threats to your safety may not end with David's arrest. Inspector Duval nodded grimly.
We're coordinating with American authorities to provide ongoing protection, but you need to understand that dismantling a criminal network of this scale often results in retaliation attempts. Elena considered this new information carefully. The prospect of substantial financial compensation was appealing, but the idea of spending years looking over her shoulder for vengeful criminals was less attractive. However, she'd already crossed the point of no return when she decided to investigate David's betrayal rather than meekly accepting her abandonment in Paris. "What would you recommend?" she asked. "Complete the legal proceedings to recover the stolen assets and claim damages, but do so from a secure location with appropriate protection," Philippe suggested. "The French government has agreements with the United States that would allow you to relocate safely while the broader investigation continues." "How long would that take?" "The asset recovery process could take several years, but the immediate danger should diminish once the higher-level criminals realize that the damage to their operations is already complete," Inspector Duval explained. "Your role in exposing the network was crucial, but you're not an ongoing threat to their remaining activities." Elena's phone rang with another international call, this time displaying a number with a Swiss country code. She looked questioningly at Philippe, who nodded for her to answer while activating recording equipment. "Elena Roswell?" The voice was unfamiliar, speaking English with a German accent. "My name is Klaus Brennan. I represent certain parties whose business interests have been affected by your recent activities in Paris." Elena met Philippe's eyes and saw him immediately gesture for other team members to join them. This was exactly the kind of contact they'd been expecting from the broader criminal network. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Elena replied carefully. "I've simply been trying to locate my husband after being abandoned during our vacation." "Mrs. Roswell, let's speak plainly. Your investigation into Meridian Capital Management has disrupted several important business relationships. My clients are prepared to offer substantial compensation if you would consider withdrawing your cooperation with law enforcement agencies." Philippe was making rapid notes and coordinating with technical specialists to trace the call. Elena needed to keep Brennan talking long enough for them to identify his location and potentially gather information about the broader criminal network. "What kind of compensation?" Elena asked. $10 million, transferred to any account you specify, in exchange for your agreement to cease all cooperation with police investigations and to sign confidentiality agreements regarding any information you may have discovered," Brennan replied. "The offer is valid for 24 hours. Elena felt a moment of vertigo at the sheer scale of the bribe being offered. $10 million would provide financial security for the rest of her life, but accepting it would also mean allowing the criminals who had victimized her to escape justice for their crimes. "That's a generous offer," Elena said, buying time while Philippe's team worked to trace the call. "But I'm curious about why my cooperation is worth so much to your clients." "The disruption of Meridian Capital's operations has created significant losses for various business partners," Brennan explained. "Your continued involvement with law enforcement agencies could potentially expand those losses. My clients prefer to resolve such matters through negotiation rather than alternative methods." The threat was clear despite the diplomatic language. Elena was being offered a choice between a substantial bribe and the possibility of violence if she continued cooperating with the investigation. "I'll need time to consider such an important decision," Elena replied. "How can I reach you with my answer?" Brennan provided a secure email address and repeated the 24-hour deadline before ending the call. Philippe immediately contacted his technical team to analyze the call data and coordinate with international partners to identify Brennan's location. "This confirms that the criminal network extends beyond Meridian Capital," Inspector Duval observed. "The fact that they're willing to offer $10 million suggests that your investigation has cost them significantly more than that amount." Elena felt a strange sense of pride at the confirmation that her actions had inflicted serious damage on a large-scale criminal operation. The abandoned wife, who had been dismissed as irrelevant by her husband and his partners, had become a threat significant enough to warrant million-dollar bribes and international coordination among criminals. "What happens if I refuse their offer?" Elena asked. "They'll likely escalate to more direct methods of persuasion," Philippe replied honestly. "But we're prepared for that possibility. The French government has a strong interest in protecting witnesses who help expose international criminal networks." Elena's decision was immediate and certain.
I refuse the offer. These people destroyed my life and tried to frame me for their crimes. I want to see them face justice for what they've done. Inspector Duval smiled approvingly. In that case, we need to move you to a more secure location while we prepare for their likely response to your refusal. As the police convoy departed Paris for an undisclosed location outside the city, Elena reflected on the complete transformation of her circumstances. A week ago, she'd been a dependent wife whose greatest concern was managing social events for her husband's business associates. Now she was a protected witness in an international criminal investigation, entitled to millions in compensation and responsible for dismantling a global money laundering network. The secure facility where Elena would spend the next several weeks was a converted monastery in the Loire Valley, surrounded by vineyards and protected by a discreet but comprehensive security presence. The irony of seeking sanctuary in a place dedicated to contemplation and spiritual reflection wasn't lost on her as she settled into accommodations that were both luxurious and completely isolated from the outside world. Philippe visited daily to update Elena on the progress of the international investigation that her discoveries had initiated. The scope of the criminal network continued to expand as law enforcement agencies in multiple countries used the Meridian Capital evidence to expose related operations and arrest additional suspects. The Swiss authorities have uncovered evidence of arms trafficking connected to the money laundering network, Philippe reported during one of his visits. Apparently, Meridian Capital wasn't just cleaning money from drug operations, they were facilitating weapon sales to various conflict zones. Elena shook her head in disgust. How could David have gotten involved in something like that? Greed and ambition make people capable of extraordinary moral compromises, Philippe replied. Your husband likely started with relatively minor financial irregularities and gradually became complicit in more serious crimes as the profitable opportunities increased. What's the current status of the cases against them? David and his 3 partners will face trial in both the United States and France, with additional charges likely from other countries as the investigation continues, Philippe explained. The evidence you gathered provides the foundation for prosecutions that should result in life sentences for the most serious offenders. Elena felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The justice being served was appropriate for the crimes that had been committed, but it also meant the complete destruction of the life she'd shared with David for 15 years. Everything they'd built together had been revealed as a facade concealing systematic criminal activity. Philippe handed Elena a legal document that would formalize her status as a cooperating witness and establish her eligibility for compensation from the criminal proceeds that were being recovered. The preliminary accounting suggests that your damages could exceed $20 million, he explained. The criminal network's assets are substantial, and your status as the primary victim of their identity theft operation gives you priority claim to the recovered funds. Elena signed the documents, officially completing her transformation from victim to the architect of the criminal network's destruction. The money would provide security and independence, but more importantly, it represented acknowledgement that she'd been wronged and had successfully fought back against those who had betrayed her. Her phone buzzed with another international call, this time from the United States. The caller identification showed it was Catherine from Sotheby's, though Elena had to verify the call through Philippe's security protocols before answering. Elena, I've been following the news reports about the international financial crimes investigation, Catherine said. I can't believe that David was involved in something like this. Neither could I until I discovered the evidence myself, Elena replied. It's been a difficult week, but I'm grateful that the truth came out. The reason I'm calling is that we've had inquiries from several law enforcement agencies about consulting with experts in art-related financial crimes, Catherine explained. Your experience in exposing this criminal network, combined with your background in authentication, makes you uniquely qualified for this kind of work. Elena felt a surge of interest. What kind of consulting work? Investigating suspicious art sales and purchases that might be connected to money laundering or other financial crimes, Catherine replied. The pay would be substantial, and the work would involve international travel to some of the world's most prestigious auction houses and galleries. Elena smiled at the irony.
Her husband's betrayal had inadvertently provided her with expertise that made her valuable to law enforcement agencies investigating financial crimes involving art and collectibles. The career she'd abandoned to support David's ambitions was now opening doors to opportunities she never could have imagined. "I'm definitely interested," Elena told Catherine. "I'll be returning to New York within the next few weeks, and I'd love to discuss the details." After ending the call, Elena walked through the monastery's ancient gardens, contemplating the future that was emerging from the wreckage of her marriage. The woman who had been abandoned in Paris with nothing but her passport and a purse would soon return to New York as a millionaire with expertise in international financial crimes and opportunities for challenging, well-compensated work that combined her professional skills with her newfound investigative abilities. David and his partners had thought it would be hilarious to ditch her in Paris, leaving her stranded and helpless while they executed their criminal plans. Their expensive mistake had created their most formidable enemy and ultimately led to the complete destruction of everything they'd worked to build. Elena's transformation was complete, but her story was just beginning. 6 months after her return to New York, Elena stood in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Patterson, Whitmore and Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms, reviewing documents that would forever alter the landscape of international financial crime prosecution. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, illuminating stacks of legal papers that represented the complete dismantling of the criminal network her husband had helped orchestrate. Attorney Sarah Patterson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in complex asset recovery cases, spread the final settlement agreements across the polished conference table. "Elena, these numbers are extraordinary even by our standards. The total recovery amount exceeds $67 million, making this one of the largest individual victim compensations in financial crimes history." Elena examined the documentation with the methodical attention to detail that had served her well during her years in art authentication. The figures were almost incomprehensible in their scope. What had begun as David's cruel joke of abandoning her in Paris had ultimately resulted in her becoming one of the wealthiest victims of financial crime in recent memory. The money represented far more than simple compensation for her losses. Under the asset forfeiture laws that applied to the international criminal network, Elena's status as the primary victim of systematic identity theft gave her legal claim to substantial portions of the criminal proceeds that had been recovered by law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. The criminals' own documentation of their crimes, which they had created to implicate her, had instead become the foundation for her massive financial windfall. The Swiss accounts alone contained $42 million that can be directly traced to transactions conducted using your stolen identity, Patterson explained. The additional $25 million represents your share of the general asset pool recovered from the broader criminal network that Meridian Capital was facilitating. Elena shook her head in continued amazement at the scale of the criminal enterprise she had inadvertently exposed. "Have all the prosecutions been completed?" "David received a life sentence without possibility of parole," Patterson replied with professional satisfaction. "The judge was particularly harsh because of the systematic nature of the identity theft and the attempted murder charges. Marcus Webb, Jonathan Pierce, and Andrew Chen each received sentences ranging from 35 to 40 years. Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions at the news of David's life sentence.
The man she had married 15 years ago no longer existed, having been replaced by someone capable of crimes she could never have imagined. The justice was appropriate, but it also represented the complete destruction of the life they had shared together. "What about the broader criminal network?" Elena asked. Patterson consulted another set of documents. 17 additional arrests across 6 countries, with prosecutions ongoing. The evidence you gathered in Paris provided the foundation for dismantling money laundering operations that had been active for over a decade. Several government officials and judges have also been charged with corruption related to their protection of the network. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Philippe, who had become both a professional contact and personal friend during the months of legal proceedings that followed her dramatic week in Paris. His message contained a news article about the final conviction of Klaus Brennan, the man who had attempted to bribe her with $10 million to cease her cooperation with law enforcement. The article detailed how Brennan's conviction had completed the prosecution of the criminal network's leadership structure,
effectively eliminating the ongoing threat to Elena's safety that had required months of protective security. She was finally free to live openly without concern for retaliation from vengeful criminals whose operations she had helped expose. Patterson gathered the signed settlement documents and placed them in a secure folder. Elena, there's one more matter we need to discuss. The International Criminal Court has requested your testimony in several upcoming trials related to the arms trafficking and human trafficking charges that emerged from the Meridian Capital investigation. Elena considered the request carefully. The prospect of testifying about her discoveries would require reliving the traumatic events of David's betrayal, but it would also provide an opportunity to ensure that justice was served for crimes that extended far beyond financial fraud. The compensation would be substantial, Patterson continued. Expert witness fees for testimony in international criminal proceedings can reach 6 figures per case, and there are currently 4 trials scheduled that would benefit from your testimony. Elena made her decision quickly. I'll do it. These people need to face consequences for all their crimes, not just the ones that affected me personally. Patterson smiled approvingly. I hoped you'd say that. Your testimony could be crucial in securing convictions for some of the most serious international crimes of the past decade. As Elena left the law firm's offices, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The abandoned wife who had stood confused and alone in the George V Hotel 6 months ago had become a key witness in international criminal prosecutions and one of the wealthiest victims of financial crime in history. Her phone rang with a call from Catherine at Sotheby's, who had become her primary contact for the consulting work that was rapidly developing into a full-time career specializing in art-related financial crimes investigation. Elena, we've received a request from the FBI's art crime team for assistance with a case involving suspected money laundering through high-end art auctions, Catherine explained. The compensation would be $50,000 for a 2-week investigation, with potential for additional work if your findings lead to broader prosecutions. Elena felt the familiar surge of intellectual excitement that accompanied challenging investigative work. What kind of art are we talking about? Impressionist paintings, primarily works by Monet and Renoir that have been selling for prices substantially above market value at several major auction houses, Catherine replied. The FBI suspects that the inflated prices represent a method for transferring illegal funds between criminal organizations. Elena's mind immediately began analyzing the possibilities. Art auctions provided an ideal vehicle for money laundering because the subjective nature of artistic value made it difficult to prove that artificially inflated prices represented criminal activity rather than legitimate market enthusiasm. I'm interested. When do they need me to start? Monday morning at the FBI's New York field office, you'll be working directly with Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who leads their financial crimes unit. Elena scheduled the meeting and continued walking through Central Park, contemplating the dramatic transformation of her professional life. The expertise she had gained in financial investigation during her pursuit of David's criminal network had opened doors to consulting opportunities that combined her art authentication background with law enforcement needs she had never known existed. Her apartment, a spacious penthouse on the Upper East Side that she had purchased with a portion of her settlement funds, represented both her newfound financial independence and her complete separation from the life she had shared with David. The space was decorated with carefully selected pieces from emerging artists, reflecting her return to the art world that had been her passion before she'd subordinated her career to her husband's ambitions. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mrs. Roswell, my name is Detective James Harrison with the Los Angeles Police Department. We have a situation involving suspected art fraud that matches cases you've consulted on. Would you be available for a confidential discussion? Elena smiled at the message, recognizing the pattern that had become familiar over the past several months. Her reputation as an expert in art-related financial crimes was spreading throughout law enforcement agencies, creating opportunities for challenging and well-compensated work that utilized both her professional expertise and her hard-won experience in complex criminal investigations. She responded to Detective Harrison's message with her availability for a phone consultation, then continued her walk through the park while contemplating the evening's plans. She was scheduled to have dinner with Philippe, who was visiting New York to coordinate with American law enforcement agencies on several ongoing international cases. Philippe had become one of Elena's closest friends during the legal proceedings that followed her dramatic week in Paris. Their professional relationship had evolved into a personal connection based on mutual respect and shared experiences in confronting sophisticated international criminals. While Elena had no interest in romantic relationships following David's betrayal, she valued Philippe's friendship and expertise as she navigated her new career in financial crimes investigation. Elena's evening with Philippe began at a quiet restaurant in Greenwich Village, where they could discuss sensitive law enforcement matters without concern for eavesdropping. Philippe arrived carrying a liver portfolio containing updates on several ongoing investigations that had emerged from the original Meridian Capital case. "The ripple effects from your discoveries continue to expand," Philippe explained as they settled into a corner booth away from other diners. "The Swiss authorities have identified connections between the Meridian Capital network and several other criminal organizations that were using similar money laundering techniques." Elena reviewed the documents Philippe provided, noting the sophisticated methods that criminals were using to exploit international banking systems and regulatory differences between countries. "How many additional prosecutions are expected?" "At least 30 more arrests across Europe and the Americas," Philippe replied. "The evidence chain that began with your investigation has become a roadmap for identifying and dismantling similar criminal networks worldwide." Elena felt a deep satisfaction at the knowledge that her painful personal experience was contributing to broader efforts to combat international financial crime. "What about the art trafficking angle that we discussed last month?" Philippe's expression became more serious. "That's actually why I wanted to speak with you tonight. We've discovered evidence that the Meridian Capital Network was involved in trafficking stolen artworks, including pieces that were looted during various international conflicts." Elena's expertise in art authentication made her immediately understand the implications. Stolen art provides an ideal vehicle for money laundering because pieces can be held for years until their provenance becomes difficult to trace, then sold through legitimate auction houses to convert criminal proceeds into clean assets. "I'm interested. When do they need me to start?" "Monday morning at the FBI's New York field office. You'll be working directly with Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who leads their financial crimes unit." Elena scheduled the meeting and continued walking through Central Park, contemplating the dramatic transformation of her professional life. The expertise she had gained in financial investigation during her pursuit of David's criminal network had opened doors to consulting opportunities that combined her art authentication background with law enforcement needs she had never known existed. Her apartment, a spacious penthouse on the Upper East Side that she had purchased with a portion of her settlement funds, represented both her newfound financial independence and her complete separation from the life she had shared with David. The space was decorated with carefully selected pieces from emerging artists, reflecting her return to the art world that had been her passion before she'd subordinated her career to her husband's ambitions. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Roswell, my name is Detective James Harrison with the Los Angeles Police Department. We have a situation involving suspected art fraud that matches cases you've consulted on. Would you be available for a confidential discussion?" Elena smiled at the message, recognizing the pattern that had become familiar over the past several months. Her reputation as an expert in art-related financial crimes was spreading throughout law enforcement agencies, creating opportunities for challenging and well-compensated work that utilized both her professional expertise and her hard-won experience in complex criminal investigations. She responded to Detective Harrison's message with her availability for a phone consultation, then continued her walk through the park while contemplating the evening's plans. She was scheduled to have dinner with Philippe, who was visiting New York to coordinate with American law enforcement agencies on several ongoing international cases. Philippe had become one of Elena's closest friends during the legal proceedings that followed her dramatic week in Paris. Their professional relationship had evolved into a personal connection based on mutual respect and shared experiences in confronting sophisticated international criminals. While Elena had no interest in romantic relationships following
Exactly, Philippe confirmed. We believe that Meridian Capital was storing and eventually selling stolen artworks as part of their broader money laundering operations. Your background in authentication, combined with your knowledge of their criminal methods, makes you uniquely qualified to help identify and recover these pieces. Elena considered the opportunity carefully. The work would involve traveling to various international locations to examine suspected stolen artworks and provide expert testimony about their authentic provenance. The compensation would be substantial, but more importantly, the work would help return stolen cultural treasures to their rightful owners or countries of origin. How many pieces are we talking about? Elena asked. The preliminary investigation suggests dozens of major works, possibly including pieces that have been missing since World War II, Philippe replied. The potential cultural and historical significance is enormous. Elena made her decision immediately. I want to be involved. This is exactly the kind of work I was meant to do. Philippe smiled at her enthusiasm. I hoped you'd say that. The first assignment would involve traveling to Geneva to examine a Picasso that recently appeared at auction, but that Swiss authorities suspect was stolen from a Jewish family during the Nazi occupation of France. Elena felt a chill of historical awareness. Art stolen during World War II represented some of the most significant cultural crimes in human history, and the opportunity to help restore these pieces to their rightful owners carried profound moral importance beyond the financial compensation. When do we start? Elena asked. Next month, assuming you can coordinate with your other consulting commitments, Philippe replied. The Swiss government is prepared to offer substantial compensation for your expertise, and success in recovering stolen artwork often leads to additional assignments with other international agencies. As their dinner continued, Elena reflected on the extraordinary trajectory her life had taken since that morning 6 months ago when she had discovered David's betrayal. The experience of being abandoned in Paris had been traumatic and humiliating, but it had also initiated a journey of self-discovery that had revealed capabilities and opportunities she never could have imagined. Elena's phone buzzed with an email from the FBI's art crime team containing details about the Impressionist painting investigation that Catherine had mentioned earlier. The case involved suspected money laundering through art auctions, but the preliminary evidence suggested connections to international drug trafficking operations that used legitimate art sales to clean their profits. The email included surveillance photos of individuals attending high-end art auctions who were suspected of representing criminal organizations seeking to convert drug proceeds into valuable artworks that could be stored or transported across international borders without detection. Elena's expertise in both art authentication and financial crimes investigation made her ideally suited to help identify suspicious bidding patterns and artificially inflated sale prices. Elena showed Philippe the FBI email, and he immediately recognized several of the individuals in the surveillance photos. These people have connections to criminal networks that we've been investigating in Europe, he observed. Your FBI case may be connected to our ongoing operations. Elena felt the familiar intellectual excitement that accompanied the discovery of unexpected connections in complex criminal investigations. What kind of connections? Money laundering operations that use art auctions to facilitate international transfers of criminal proceeds, Philippe explained. The criminals purchase artworks at inflated prices in one country, then arrange for those pieces to be sold in different countries at prices that reflect their actual market value. The difference between the purchase and sale prices represents cleaned money that can be transferred internationally without triggering banking regulations. Elena understood the scheme immediately. So a criminal organization might pay $5 million for a painting actually worth $2 million, then sell it for its true value in a different country. The extra $3 million represents cleaned criminal proceeds that have been successfully transferred across international borders. Exactly, Philippe confirmed, and the auction houses often cooperate because they profit from the inflated sale prices, even if they suspect the transactions aren't entirely legitimate. Elena's mind was already analyzing the investigative possibilities. If we can document the pattern of artificially inflated purchases followed by sales at true market value, we can trace the flow of criminal money and identify both the criminal organizations and the complicit auction houses. Philippe nodded approvingly.
Your FBI investigation and our European operations could provide mutual support for a comprehensive effort to shut down these art-based money laundering networks. As they left the restaurant, Elena felt energized by the prospect of challenging investigative work that would combine her professional expertise with her experience in confronting sophisticated international criminals. The opportunities emerging from her traumatic experience in Paris were transforming her from a victim of crime into one of the world's leading experts in combating art-related financial fraud. Elena's apartment building doorman handed her a package that had been delivered earlier in the evening. The return address indicated it was from the International Court in The Hague, containing materials for her upcoming testimony in the trial of individuals connected to the human trafficking operations that had been exposed through the Meridian Capital investigation. Elena reviewed the trial materials in her apartment, studying testimony from victims who had been trafficked by the criminal network that her husband had helped finance through money laundering operations. The documents detailed horrific crimes involving forced labor and sexual exploitation that had been funded by the supposedly legitimate investment activities of Meridian Capital Management. The weight of moral responsibility settled on Elena as she read victim impact statements describing lives destroyed by the criminal network that David had facilitated. Her discovery of his betrayal had not only saved her from being framed for his crimes, it had also exposed a criminal enterprise responsible for immeasurable human suffering. Elena's testimony at The Hague would help ensure that the individuals responsible for these crimes faced appropriate consequences, but she also felt obligated to use her newfound wealth and expertise to support efforts to combat similar criminal networks. The money she had recovered represented an opportunity to make a meaningful difference in the world beyond simply securing her own financial future. Elena spent the weekend researching charitable organizations that combated human trafficking and supported victims of international financial crimes. She identified several groups that would benefit from substantial financial contributions, but she was more interested in providing ongoing support through her expertise in financial investigation rather than simply writing checks. On Monday morning, Elena arrived at the FBI's New York field office to begin her investigation into suspected money laundering through art auctions. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez was an energetic woman in her 40s who specialized in complex financial crimes and had extensive experience working with expert consultants. Elena, we're grateful for your assistance with this case, Agent Rodriguez began as they settled into a conference room filled with surveillance photos and financial documents. Your background in art authentication, combined with your experience with international money laundering networks, makes you uniquely qualified to help us understand what we're seeing. Elena examined the evidence materials, immediately recognizing patterns that suggested sophisticated criminal activity. The auction records showed multiple instances of artworks selling for prices substantially above their established market values, with the excess payments coming from shell companies registered in countries known for lax financial regulations. The pattern is classic money laundering, Elena observed. Criminal organizations are using legitimate art auctions to convert illegal proceeds into valuable assets that can be stored, transported, or resold without triggering banking regulations. Agent Rodriguez nodded. What we need from you is expert analysis of which specific transactions represent genuine market activity versus artificially inflated prices that indicate money laundering. Elena spent the next several hours reviewing auction records and comparing sale prices to established market valuations for similar artworks. The analysis revealed a clear pattern of systematic price manipulation involving dozens of transactions over the past 2 years. These Monet paintings sold for prices that are consistently 30 to 50% above comparable market sales, Elena explained, highlighting specific transactions on a timeline chart.
The excess payments represent criminal proceeds being laundered through the auction system. Agent Rodriguez studied Elena's analysis with growing excitement. If we can prove that these price differences represent money laundering rather than legitimate market enthusiasm, we have grounds for asset forfeiture proceedings that could recover millions in criminal proceeds. Elena continued her investigation throughout the week, identifying additional suspicious transactions and documenting the money laundering patterns with the methodical precision that had served her well during her pursuit of David's criminal network. The scope of the criminal activity was substantial, involving multiple auction houses and criminal organizations across several countries.
By Friday afternoon, Elena had compiled a comprehensive report documenting over $40 million in suspected money laundering activity through art auctions during the past 2 years. The evidence would support criminal prosecutions against the individuals involved and asset forfeiture proceedings to recover the laundered criminal proceeds. "This is extraordinary work," Agent Rodriguez commented as she reviewed Elena's final report. "Your analysis provides the foundation for dismantling an entire money laundering network that we've been investigating for months without making substantial progress." Elena felt the familiar satisfaction of completing a challenging investigation that would result in justice for criminal activity. What happens next? Coordinated arrests and asset seizures across multiple jurisdictions, followed by prosecutions that should result in substantial prison sentences and financial penalties, Agent Rodriguez explained. "Your expert testimony will be crucial in explaining the money laundering patterns to judges and juries." Elena's phone rang with a call from Philippe, who was calling from Geneva with updates on the stolen artwork investigation they had discussed earlier in the week. "Elena, the Picasso we're examining has been confirmed as a piece stolen from the Rosenberg family in Paris during the Nazi occupation," Philippe reported. "Your expertise in authentication and provenance research would be invaluable in building the case for returning the piece to the family's heirs." Elena felt a surge of excitement at the opportunity to help restore stolen artwork to its rightful owners. "When do you need me in Geneva?" "Next week, if possible," Philippe replied. "The Swiss authorities are prepared to provide substantial compensation for your consultation, and success in this case could lead to involvement in recovering additional stolen artworks across Europe." Elena coordinated her schedule to accommodate the Geneva assignment while continuing her work with the FBI on the money laundering investigation. The combination of consulting opportunities was providing both substantial income and intellectually challenging work that utilized her expertise in meaningful ways. As Elena prepared for her trip to Geneva, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation of her life during the 6 months since David's betrayal. The woman who had been abandoned in Paris with nothing but her passport and purse had become one of the world's leading experts in art-related financial crimes, with consulting opportunities that spanned multiple continents and involved some of the most significant criminal investigations of the decade. Elena's success represented far more than simple financial recovery from her husband's crimes. She had transformed her traumatic experience into expertise that was helping law enforcement agencies worldwide combat sophisticated criminal networks and recover stolen cultural treasures for their rightful owners. The wealth she had gained through the asset forfeiture proceedings provided financial security that allowed her to choose consulting assignments based on their importance and intellectual challenge rather than simply their compensation. Elena was becoming a force for justice in the international art world, using her hard-won expertise to expose criminal activity and protect cultural heritage. Elena's flight to Geneva departed on a crisp October morning, carrying her toward another opportunity to apply her investigative skills to significant criminal cases. As the plane climbed above New York's skyline, Elena looked down at the city where she had rebuilt her life and career following David's betrayal. The view reminded her of the morning 6 months ago when she had returned from Paris, uncertain about her future but determined to fight for justice. That determination had led to the complete dismantling of an international criminal network, substantial financial compensation for her losses, and the beginning of a new career that combined her professional passion with meaningful work, combating international crime. Elena's transformation was complete, but her impact on international law enforcement efforts was just beginning. The expertise she had gained through her painful personal experience was opening doors to consulting opportunities that would span years and involve some of the most significant criminal investigations in the art world. David and his partners had thought it would be hilarious to ditch Elena in Paris, leaving her stranded and helpless while they executed their criminal plans. Their expensive mistake had created their most formidable enemy and ultimately led to consequences that extended far beyond the destruction of their own criminal enterprise. Elena's story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating victims of crime, but it had also become an inspiring example of how traumatic experiences could be transformed into expertise that serves the broader cause of justice. The abandoned wife had become an internationally recognized expert whose work was helping law enforcement agencies worldwide combat sophisticated criminal networks and recover stolen cultural treasures. The wealth she had gained through the asset forfeiture proceedings provided financial security that allowed her to choose consulting assignments based on their importance and intellectual challenge rather than simply their compensation. Elena was becoming a force for justice in the international art world, using her hard-won expertise to expose criminal activity and protect cultural heritage. Elena's flight to Geneva departed on a crisp October morning, carrying her toward another opportunity to apply her investigative skills to significant criminal cases. As the plane climbed above New York's skyline, Elena looked down at the city where she had rebuilt her life and career following David's betrayal. The view reminded her of the morning 6 months ago when she had returned from Paris, uncertain about her future but determined to fight for justice. That determination had led to the complete dismantling of an international criminal network, substantial financial compensation for her losses, and the beginning of a new career that combined her professional passion with meaningful work combating international crime. Elena's transformation was complete, but her impact on international law enforcement efforts was just beginning. The expertise she had gained through her painful personal experience was opening doors to consulting opportunities that would span years and involve some of the most significant criminal investigations in the art world. David and his partners had thought it would be hilarious to ditch Elena in Paris, leaving her stranded and helpless while they executed their criminal plans. Their expensive mistake had created their most formidable enemy and ultimately led to consequences that extended far beyond the destruction of their own criminal enterprise. Elena's story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating victims of crime, but it had also become an inspiring example of how traumatic experiences could be transformed into expertise that serves the broader cause of justice. The abandoned wife had become an internationally recognized expert whose work was helping law enforcement agencies worldwide combat sophisticated criminal networks and recover stolen cultural treasures. The wealth she had gained through the asset forfeiture proceedings provided financial security that allowed her to choose consulting assignments based on their importance and intellectual challenge rather than simply their compensation. Elena was becoming a force for justice in the international art world, using her hard-won expertise to expose criminal activity and protect cultural heritage. Elena's flight to Geneva departed on a crisp October morning, carrying her toward another opportunity to apply her investigative skills to significant criminal cases. As the plane climbed above New York's skyline, Elena looked down at the city where she had rebuilt her life and career following David's betrayal. The view reminded her of the morning 6 months ago when she had returned from Paris, uncertain about her future but determined to fight for justice. That determination had led to the complete dismantling of an international criminal network, substantial financial compensation for her losses, and the beginning of a new career that combined her professional passion with meaningful work combating international crime. Elena's transformation was complete, but her impact on international law enforcement efforts was just beginning. The expertise she had gained through her painful personal experience was opening doors to consulting opportunities that would span years and involve some of the most significant criminal investigations in the art world. David and his partners had thought it would be hilarious to ditch Elena in Paris, leaving her stranded and helpless while they executed their criminal plans. Their expensive mistake had created their most formidable enemy and ultimately led to consequences that extended far beyond the destruction of their own criminal enterprise. Elena's story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating victims of crime, but it had also become an inspiring example of how traumatic experiences could be transformed into expertise that serves the broader cause of justice. The abandoned wife had become an internationally recognized expert whose work was helping law enforcement agencies worldwide combat sophisticated criminal networks and recover stolen cultural treasures. As Elena's plane crossed the Atlantic toward Geneva and her next assignment, investigating stolen artwork, she felt profound satisfaction at the knowledge that David's cruel betrayal had ultimately led to her discovering capabilities and opportunities she never could have imagined. The money laundering network that had destroyed her marriage had also provided the foundation for a new career that combined financial security with intellectually challenging work that made a meaningful difference in the world. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Agent Rodriguez, containing news about the art auction money laundering case. Arrest warrants issued for 12 individuals across 4 countries. Asset seizure proceedings initiated for $47 million in suspected criminal proceeds. Your testimony scheduled for next month. Excellent work.